So I wonder if we could pick up on some combination of things from yesterday afternoon, things that came up in Andy's talk, and then things that came up in the discussion just now. So the rather complicated list of things that were on the board yesterday. There were a number that were boxed with stars, and I think Andy has given us some other things, and Jamie just gave us another one that potentially are notions of depth that do count as in the math, or at least have a chance of being in the math. And so, of course, one thing we've seen pretty clearly is that there are a few different things floating around that we want to use this word depth to latch onto, but maybe it would be interesting to see if any of them are going to count as not purely psychological or not purely contextual, somehow objective. So, oh no, this is the terrible one. So the first two of these are, I guess the first one's from yesterday. It's just, so I'm not just repeating last minute, but I will get to the sense in which I'm not in a moment. So it ties together disparate fields. Of course, there's this question about how to individuate fields, whether that's in the math or not. Set that aside for a moment. Using Andy's language, there's this issue of requires, or perhaps admits, an impure proof. So certainly one theme from yesterday was that proofs that required, or theorems that required us to draw on different areas in some way, or that could be proved insightfully by drawing on different areas, had some depth. Right, and then there was the cosmological view that Andy presented, or there's this idea of a difference in the degree of order of the conclusion and the premises, right? So there's somehow more order in the conclusion than the premises. Now, I think that this is related to something else that came up yesterday, which was the idea that deep theorems have some sort of organizational power, right? Because if you're somehow getting more order, you might think that there's a sense in which your theorem has organized things that you didn't recognize to be organized. But I don't think these are quite identical. So you might say, has organizational power. And then Jamie just suggested a notion of objective simplicity. I'm sorry, objective surprisingness.
Yeah, I'm not sure that.
I'm not sure I entirely
well, the idea was that the people were using surprisingness as one of the things that might be involved in depth. Even though I'm not myself sure that I would say that, I do think if we are going to talk about surprising, we want to make that distinction. So,
yeah.
Sorry to be so pedantic, but I myself wasn't suggesting that objective surprisingness need be part of an account of depth, but rather if we are going to use it as an account of depth, we should sort of understand it in this way, which is less psychological.
Right.
Sorry, that's
okay. So I shouldn't saddle you with it.
Well, just so you understand, just to understand what if I'm be saying something false, I want to be held responsible for exactly the false thing I'm saying, and not some other false thing.
Right, and I guess Marc gave a sort of persistification of this, right, of results that somehow went against where we had a situation where we had non-deductive reasons for believing some assertion, and it turned out that our non-deductive reasons were having misled us somehow. Okay, but the reason I wrote these down was there was an interesting sense, I think, in which Andy's example this morning was an example of a theorem that was deep in the sense of 3, but not in 2, and potentially not in 1 as well. And that struck me as an interesting thing to explore further, because we certainly, I mean, 1 and 2 were things that have come up in a bunch of different ways yesterday. And here at least it seems like we have a case where an elementary and pure proof of a deep result has been presented. So I'm curious, so I guess we have 3 without 1 and 2.
It depends on whether you interpret 2 as requires or admits.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point, right? So we did see that it admits impure proofs. Okay, so, and would you say though that it is 3 without 1?
I think so. I think that the theorem is pretty clearly in additive combinatorics
Yeah.
as an area. That area.
But the proofs, some of the proofs are tying together. Just for
That's
proofs. Are
true.
there any actual results that, I mean, usually you take Dirichlet's theorem on regressions. The theorem is in one area, but it's tying together disparate things because the proof
For
is
the
on.
proof, yeah. So we'd have to decide if 1 is, what's doing the tying in 1? Is it the proof or the proofs, or is it the theorem itself? If we say the theorem itself, I think that 3, we could have 3 without 1. If it's the proofs, then I'm not sure. It's not.
I see. So if one stuck with the pure proof,
Yeah.
then it would be.
It doesn't tie together anything but arithmetic combinatorics.
And actually, I think Mario gave us some examples of the few deep facts, for instance, in complex analysis. I mean, they're just facts of complex analysis, right? I mean, we don't. Right. I don't know.
Well, they lead to all kinds of other things.
But do you think that they somehow? I mean, you don't need to do anything other than complex analysis to prove things about analyticity and.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
There's something that's missing, something just to me that I've been talking about a lot. We haven't written down that something create a new field. Unified fields. We found something surprising. But some of the really deep results, and probably some of the really surprising counter examples, think of Francis spin-on parameters remark, open up a new field.
Mm-hmm. So do you think though that
And that's
notion
part
could
of the measure
possibly
of depth. We go, wow, this means here's stuff to do.
Sort of like maybe the
that we never
Poincaré
suspected
recursion,
before.
or Poincaré recurrence theorem, just
Yeah.
sort of open up ergodic
Yeah.
theory.
But could that possibly be within the math as opposed to within
Yeah,
us? I mean,
sure.
presumably it has something to do with.
Well, I mean, exactly what Alice said. If you find some, your dream theorem collapses, then you start saying, well, why is it collapsed? It's collapsed because, and you said, there's great new stuff to do. So,
But I mean, I guess I mean.
but I would have thought that in some sense the novelty of, that's what you see, in Andy's case, what's really happening is these guys are saying, there is a new field which we have missed, out of additive combinatorics. Right, this is just a new subject. Right, that's I think it's the big push, and I'm not sure you didn't say so, quoting Tim Gowers. It's not just an amazing result of Summer-Ages theorem. Here is a new bit of mathematics, which is significant. And this is a new field we've never done before. That's part of what's being asserted, I think, by these people, not just this is a great theorem, right? So the first invoked proof says we can understand this using ergodic theory, which we regard as explanatory already.
Mm-hmm.
But up to a point, these people are saying, yeah, fine, thank you very much, but that's not the whole story. The whole part of the story is this is something completely new here and big.
But I guess what I'm worried about is that it's new to us, right? That it has to do with what areas of
Well,
mathematics
that's any
we've
different from
spent
worrying about
time.
disparate, is it?
Well, there is this question as to how to I mean, So as Jamie pointed out yesterday, that
Yeah,
how
sure,
we
I
recognize
mean,
it.
sorry, I'm not so bothered, so I should be if I was the philosopher, but it's, all that is, we haven't said new about something we would say is deep.
So you think I should write up here among the things that are potentially in the
Open to
map?
new
that-
field would, I mean, you know, when you look at the obituaries of these guys, you frequently see that their great achievement was to open up the field of X.
I see. Okay, so perhaps if we're going to allow that, we can make sense of some non-us related notion of fields being distinct or being disparate,
Mhm.
and that they can be tied together by some result. So we could also allow them for the possibility that we're moving into some other,
Yeah.
also disparate field, one that we
Yeah,
happen
it's
not
a
to
kind
have seen.
of disparate field, I agree.
So if there's one example, sorry, Phil. There's one example of this that I think actually is worth mentioning in part because it ties into also the issue about whether or not deep proofs can contribute, whether trivial theorems can have deep proofs. And the Ramsey theory was started by the Ramsey theorem, which was itself proven as this minor lemma in the course of proving a now completely forgotten that I can't even remember what it was, fact about the propositional calculus. Very, very, very deep proof, kind of ultimately insignificant fact, and gave rise to this entirely new field of which books are being written. Theorems, things that are independent of piano arithmetic are being formulated and proven, things like that. So I'm agreeing, saying here's another one, and it has this funny side observation.
So, can you come up though with, pointing to maybe some examples that have already been discussed of other cases which, like Andy's example, are some of these but not others? Because it would be interesting to find out if, so we already know that there are various senses in which where depth or deep is getting used here, and at least some of them are psychological. It would be interesting though if even the ones that we think aren't necessarily psychological are still tracking potentially different things, or if all of these somehow come together in general. So we have some reason to think that they don't necessarily come together. So maybe this is too hard a question.
One thing I'm wondering, I've been thinking, it's been bothering me, this discussion, Gower's comments on Samaritan's theorem, that it isn't, it makes me wonder whether his comment about calling it deep, that original proof is complicated, but it was far from clear that original proof really was deep rather than simply hard. There's a distinction between things that are hard. I couldn't do it and somebody did it, and so that was hard, but then Gowers had given a proof that perhaps in fact was deep in the sense of having these other connections, and it's not, there's a tendency to if your work is building on somebody else's work, then it's sort of praising the other person's work is deep. So somewhat says, okay, so now my work building on this must be very deep. Not that Gowers needed to promote his own work in that sense, but that one tends to, when you see connections that original work allowed building, that makes that original work in some sense deeper than it was in its initial complicatedness without necessarily really having its quality of depth. And so it's maybe the depth that Gowers attributing is not to the original proof as much as to the fruitfulness of the whole the direction that was built.
That's right. You keep careful between what's deep about the theorem and what's deep about its proofs. those seem to me to be two different things, maybe not, they don't need to be the same thing at all.
Can I take the conversation in a very different direction?
Yeah, sure.
Something that keeps coming up and which your list presupposes is that we're after a sort of objective notion of depth. Subjectivity or psychology or interest relativity seems to be something we're trying to avoid for some reason, or at least a lot of people are keep sort of hedging on that. And I'm curious why that is. Nobody has explained why that would be bad if some prominent concept of depth is interest relative or subjective. And maybe it's just an intuition that some people have here, and that's the end of it. But part of the reason I'm asking this is I'm wondering about what's the methodology of what we're doing here. If what we're doing is a sociology of mathematics, then it might turn out that it is an interest relative or a subjective notion, even if it doesn't seem to me that intuitively that it is, right? Because we have to look at empirically what mathematicians mean by the concept. So I'm just curious if anybody has thoughts about that.
So I think one of the roles that we would want depth to play was one of the roles that someone who's just depth might play as a sort of theoretical virtue role, along the lines of like simplicity and philosophy of science. And if that's right, then we should be using depth as a way of adjudicating between possibly theories to present, or even just avenues for further study. Then you might think that we want it to be objective in the sense that it's not, then it's not going to be, you might think, okay, truth. And I think that's mistaken. I don't think that's necessarily correct, especially since, I mean, if you look at simplicity, you think that too is in fact a viable theoretical virtue. It's not clear that that's objective, or at least we need to fix a certain type of creature who's determining whether it's simple in order to get an objective judgment of that. And so I think that might be part of what's going on, is that we're worried that if we say, this is a guide to X, and this guide is subjective and X must be subjective, I think that principle is just wrong. But that's just sort of my thought.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on that, and I appreciate the comment, but I mean, it doesn't seem to make sense to think of depth as something which is playing an analogous role in mathematics, what simplicity might play in choices between physical theories, right? Because often what's done there is you say, look, given two different theories, I'm going to pick the simplest one, if you're convinced that simplicity is a guide. Saying, well, the simplest one is the one that we're going to consider to be true. I mean, of course, that doesn't apply here, because they're all theorems, right? I mean, if you take depth to be something that pertains to theorems, then if they are theorems, then you can't think of depth as playing the role of taking you from, like, saying, oh, it has this property that it's deep, and therefore I'm going to think it's true, in the same way that you take simplicity to play that role, to take you from physical theory to accepting it as a sort of a true description of reality.
Yeah,
so I mean,
it's more like
that
Marc
said,
saying it's like the superlative of saying.
and I say that because I actually think that what you said was right. I mean, it's surprising to me as an outsider to this field, and no pun intended, that you would think that the right thing to do here is to try to come up with an objective notion of depth at all. Because if you look at, I mean, that seems sort of misplaced. Why would you think that that's what you should be aiming for? I mean, if the enterprise here is this kind of sociological thing, how do mathematicians use the notion of depth in what they're doing? At the very least, you wouldn't have to, I mean, it'd be odd to assume that the only way that they could be using it is in some sort of objective sense.
I'm not sure that that's what's going on, though, that that's the right way of thinking about what one would be trying to do if one were trying to find an objective notion of depth, right? So it's not that you're assuming that there is an objective notion, you're asking, is there one? And so my goal in writing these down was just to say, well, there are a few things that have come up that at least are candidates to be one, and we can ask whether we think that they hold water, whether we think that they somehow, that they're all different sides of the same thing, or if they're distinct objective senses that are also all getting captured by depth. Or if it turns out that all of these too are in some sense or some important sense subjective.
And with that in mind, I was actually going to say this earlier, but with respect to 5, I mean, I don't think this is just purely semantics. I think having seen how people have been thinking about that thing that you have with 5, it seems that it's not objective surprisingness that people are getting at. What they're getting at is non-epistemic surprisingness, right? They're trying to say that there's a notion of surprisingness which is not just the surprisingness that given what we knew, this particular thing is a surprising result. It's not that kind of surprisingness, it's something else. And trying to articulate what that something else is obviously the difficult thing. I think that's where it was heading in listening to the conversations about what 5 was. It was something like that, non-epistemic surprisingness.
There is at least some sense in which we might use depth to adjudicate between theories. So this is sort of coming out of Maddie's work actually. Her book Defending the Axioms is sort of about using depth as an objective guide to perspective set theory. One place where you might think this is relevant is choosing whether or not to include the axiom of choice in your set theory. And of course you can have multiple set theories, but the question is sort of what's the set theory, what is the correct set theory? And part of that argument is, look, if we don't have the axiom of choice, we end up with a lot less depth in our set theory, or at least we close off our own interesting impacts. Or at least that's sort of part of what's going on. I was always concerned with her, but she's not here because I'm probably not the best person for her view. She probably is, but at least there's some sense in which we can carve out a role, a theoretical virtue type role for depth.
Yeah, I want to say too, I don't think that anyone is under any misconception that depth is always used in like some sort of objective sense. Everyone agrees there are many times that the mathematicians are saying something is deep, and that is meant maybe just as some sort of honorific, or maybe it's meant that, wow, that was hard, or I couldn't have proved that myself. But the question is whether looking at the practice, we can delimit those kinds of uses of depth from another class, and then that we can find something that unifies that class, and that has some sort of objective meaning, and then we can use that for these other goals. So I think that's the name of the game here. So it isn't just sociology, because we're not just taking it as given, but we're trying, like the practices surrounding depth as a given, rather we're trying to delimit them and distinguish one kind of use from another. I think that's what we're doing. That's what I'm doing.
Well, I'm just recommending, in view of the course the discussion just took, that instead of focusing merely on the circumstances of application of the term depth and trying to list them and regiment them, we have a different blackboard, a whiteboard, for the consequences of application. What role is depth supposed to be doing? Is it, I mean, we have just a few that have come up in the last 5 minutes, so there's, as it were, mere honorific. I don't know whether you want to keep the mere in there, but it's by way of contrast with the other ones. There's deciding among potential axioms, searching for truth, serving as a theoretical virtue in much the way that simplicity or parsimony or whatever your favorite theoretical virtues are in science, the roles that they play. There's identifying the right concepts or the right definitions, or the ones that cut nature at its joints, whatever nature is and whatever the joints are with regard to mathematics. That came up too. There are probably others as well, but we seem to have gotten focused on the circumstances of application, and we probably should be at least as focused on the consequences of application. Maybe for different consequences, there will be different circumstances, and there are several different notions.
How should I write down the third one you just said?
I don't remember the third
The
one.
third one was the
The right definition, the right concepts,
Oh.
the concepts that cut nature at its joint. I think that's what I said. The natural mathematical kinds. I didn't say that, but that's what I could have said.
So I should observe that lunch is outside, and so this might be a natural place to pick up the discussion.
Let's go for
Pick up the discussion period in the afternoon.